Welcome to episode 37 of Inside Politics, for teens, by teens, where I explore the politics and issues impacting your generation. I'm your host, Christina Li, and today I'm focusing on federal immigration policy. For this, I've invited Madhuri Grewal, Federal Immigration Policy Counsel at the ACLU National Political Advocacy Department. Madhu, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for being here today. So let's jump right in. So can you talk about your work as Federal Immigration Policy Counsel at the ACLU?
Sure. So, as the Federal Immigration Policy Counsel, I am basically leading our federal advocacy work on immigration policy, which entails lobbying before Congress. In a previous administration that was a little bit more open to meeting with advocates, I would also be working with the executive branch and with agencies on our policy recommendations from the ACLU. We focus on a number of areas related to the immigration system. It ranges from access to counsel, to immigration courts, to our asylum system, to detention and enforcement. So I work on a host of issues, and it really often depends on just kind of what's moving either in Congress or what the federal government is carrying out, and whether or not it aligns with our views on civil rights and civil liberties.
Understood. So how can the average citizen better understand federal immigration?
It's a great question. Certainly, there are a number of immigration policy groups out there who have a lot of explainers on their websites to kind of walk you through what our system looks like. But in a nutshell, our federal government is in charge of immigration. We have our immigration agencies are primarily housed under the Department of Homeland Security, with the exception of immigration courts, which are actually housed within the Department of Justice. And so all of our country's immigration courts operate under the U.S. Department of Justice, and there are immigration courts across the country. We have a system of 200 plus immigration detention centers operated by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and then Customs and Border Protection, or CBP, also operates short-term detention facilities along the border that are intended for processing. So that's kind of our system. Then we've got what you would think of as sort of like the path to legal immigration, which is under USCIS. And that's also within the Department of Homeland Security. So there's a number of federal agencies that sort of operate our huge web, in a way, you could think of, that oversee our country's immigration policies. And then finally, and this is something the ACLU has been concerned with for quite some time, is state and local entanglement with federal immigration enforcement in particular. So you oftentimes see what are known as 287G agreements, and those are agreements between local police departments or local sheriffs with ICE. And they essentially, what they can do includes deputizing state and local law enforcement to act as immigration enforcement officers. And what it oftentimes leads to is racial profiling, so that local law enforcement can pick up immigrants and then sort of turn them over to ICE. There are also what's known as detainer policies. So if someone's arrested, they'll detain someone for the purposes of turning them over to federal law enforcement. We believe that federal agencies that is where immigration should be housed, and state and local law enforcement shouldn't be in the practice of enforcing immigration laws. That should rest with the federal government. What we have seen time and time again is that it leads to increased racial profiling and just a lot of civil rights and civil liberties concerns with state and local law enforcement trying to carry out immigration enforcement. And that's where, I don't know if you've ever heard of Sheriff Joe Arpaio, but he's one of the most notorious sheriffs for carrying out these 287G agreements. And we've sort of seen the impact of that on as word has spread about his practices, you've seen that grow on a national level.
Understood. So I guess when the average citizen views the issue of federal immigration, I think there's a lot of othering that goes on, right? So instead of like seeing them as like seeing immigrants as fellow humans, it's a lot of like us versus them. And especially if somebody does not have is like their immediate family might not be immigrants, or maybe they just like don't really think it pertains to them. Do you have any advice for, I guess, like humanizing the issue more and like embracing this sort of like empathy in order to better understand the issue?
It's a great question. I think um, the reality is that all of us, except for Indigenous people, are immigrants. And so everyone has come to this country for the most part, right? Unless you are a Native American, you've come to this country as an immigrant. And some have been here longer than others, but all of our ties lead to other parts of the world. Now, I know that doesn't really do much for what we are in this current, what's happening in this country in this current moment with the racism and xenophobia that's really just openly being practiced. I think like the best thing I can say is that it's helpful to have conversations and really get to know people. I know that sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction to want to assume that it's hard to break cultural barriers or language barriers. But again, like I said, I think everyone comes here from somewhere else. And I think if people keep that in the back of their minds, it allows you to be a little bit more open to different communities.
I see. And I guess how has the political, like, do you have any thoughts on how like the political rhetoric has, I guess, like contributed to this a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten horrible over the last 4 years of the Trump administration. People are unafraid to be unabashed racists. It's sort of accepted that that is Trump's base, and many people think he won by appealing to that worst instinct in people. And so it's definitely disappointing to see how out in the open it is. But it's also been interesting to see the level of engagement from people who just don't want to see our country devolve into that. Everything from the Women's March to the protests of this past summer have shown us that there's actually like a great degree of hope and a desire to see something different and our country turn to a more positive direction. And so I think that is the thing that carries many people forward to sort of engage and continue engaging in politics. But certainly, yeah, things are totally divisive in our country, and that's unfortunately a large majority of Americans just sort of are fed up with it and have disengaged. But it's also interesting to see how many people are taking voting seriously, and I think we'll see what happens with the elections in November, which direction this country is going to be headed in.
Mm-hmm. And I guess from the viewpoint of somebody who's advocating for federal immigration policy change, how much of your work is in like how much of the success of your work is influenced by, I guess, like public opinion on the issue?
So I would say actually my part of what I see my role in the larger political realm is actually to exercise some degree of influence over what people think. So I think like a great example is detention. And so I think, I have been working on issues related to detention, ICE detention policy for years. Since law school, when I represented someone who was detained, he was actually a refugee um, who ended up being subject to mandatory detention, and um, he was detained. He was in the middle of a number of surgeries, and so he actually had like metal plates in his shoulder and ICE wouldn't let him complete his series of surgeries. And so he spent months in detention, just in severe pain. And unfortunately, his story is not unique to the ICE detention system. And that was the first time that I was exposed to that system. And I think up until then, I had not really understood who was in detention or why they were there. And the reality is, it is a host of different people in ICE detention, ranging from asylum seekers to people who have been here in the country for decades, who have US citizen children and ties to our community, who are active members in local churches. And I think, like, for me, being able to shed some light on that to the public, to be able to humanize stories of people who are in detention so that people can start to actually question why these infrastructures exist, is a unique part of my job, or how I view my role in politics, to make members of Congress understand the humanity of people who are caged for merely being undocumented, right? Like, our system, our detention system is civil. Nobody is in ICE detention serving a sentence. And even if, you know, like, and that's like that's not an acceptance of like our criminal justice system or mass incarceration, but just to say, like, ICE detention looks no different than a jail. Oftentimes they are actually county jails. But in practice, it's just supposed to be civil detention designed to just have people show up at their court hearings, which they could do even if they weren't detained. And so I think there's like a lot of questions about why we even have detention in the first place. And to have these conversations with lawmakers and have them encourage them to actually visit ICE detention facilities for themselves, we've actually seen that has changed members of Congress's minds about how our detention and enforcement system works, just when they go and visit a facility.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, like, I guess my question was about, like, if the public is I guess, like, also advocating strongly for this issue and for a specific policy that they want, does that, like, I guess that, like, helps you, like, that helps your work succeed in, I guess, like, getting passed in.
Oh yeah, definitely. Sorry, I may have misunderstood your question, but yes, absolutely. I mean, that's definitely also a piece of my work, is getting the public mobilized around policy changes that we want to see. So, for example, you know, I think there is a majority of Americans support a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million plus undocumented and stateless people living in this country. My job is to mobilize that majority of Americans who want to see that happen, to make calls to Congress, to sign petitions, to show up at town halls and rallies once COVID is over. You know, we can't do that now. But to have people show up, exercise their people power, and make changes in our laws. So yeah, I definitely do that in conjunction with our campaign strategists and organizers here at the ACLU, to mobilize our base to make their demands heard in Congress.
Understood. So I guess when we're looking at present day, what would you say are, like, the key issues of federal immigration policy that we need to focus on right now?
Yeah, great question. So I think, you know, if we have a change in administrations and we have a potential Biden-Harris administration, there will be a few really urgent pieces. One, I think, undoing everything that Trump has done, which is not going to be an easy task. Some of the things that we have seen, you know, a virtual end to asylum at the border, transforming of our immigration courts, you know, we've seen family separation, we've seen an uptick in detention. There's just been so much damage under this administration in the last 4 years. It's honestly quite breathtaking. And so one of the first most urgent priorities for the next administration is to undo all of that damage. But that's not enough, because we know that if we had another Trump, you know, say in 4 years, we get someone similar to Trump, they'll just take the existing infrastructure and they can do what they want. They can do exactly what Trump did again. They can build it all back up, unless we change the laws and policies and infrastructure so that can't happen again. And so that involves shutting down ICE detention facilities, because we already know there is too much detention. That involves giving less discretion to Border Patrol agents so they can't separate families at the border. That involves ensuring that there's a pathway to citizenship so that people aren't living in the shadows and can't be rounded up by ICE. That involves changing our immigration courts so that they're not subject to political interference. So there's like a lot of visionary changes that can happen if there's an administration that is open to using their political capital to make those visionary changes take place.
Understood. And I guess just pulling this back to the theme of the podcast, which is Gen Z, have you seen a difference in the way that federal immigration policy, like the general opinion of federal immigration policy, is perceived in younger generations versus older generations?
That's a really good question. You know, I think that younger generations have a lot more hope and are able to think outside of existing structures for what is possible. So older generations, and I think this just comes with like the way, even my generation, right? You know, the way we were raised, we sort of were raised under existing structures. And if we have seen anything in the last 4 years, is that people actually do turn out when you give them a vision for what is possible. And I think what I have seen with younger generations, young people actually are able to reimagine a different world in a way that I think sometimes older generations aren't. That's not to say older generations don't have people who are thinking like that. I just think there's less of them. And so with younger generations, what I have seen is that a lot of things that seemed very radical to older generations are actually normalized now. Prison abolition, abolishing ICE, abolishing DHS, like defunding the police. Like these are chants and things that I never thought I would see on a mass scale. But that I'm seeing younger generations sort of take up this mantle to reimagine what a just and fair world looks like. And while older generations were certainly talking about these things, they were never like politically popular in the way I'm seeing now. So I think that's different. And it's exciting to see that sort of hope and vision for our future.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess one other goal of this podcast is to impel, I guess, Generation Z to get involved, because I think sometimes we just kind of like become apathetic and maybe think that we can't really make a difference. So do you have any words, because we want to be able to like channel this like really unique power of our youth to, I guess, like make change. So do you have any like words of advice to impel action?
Yeah, I would just say that that your power does actually matter. You know, what I think of is that young girl challenging Senator Feinstein in her office about climate change. And Senator, I don't know if you've seen that, it went viral a while ago, but basically it was like I want to say she was like 10 years old. And she went into Senator Feinstein's office to sort of demand more progressive action and a bolder vision for climate change. And Senator Feinstein tried to tell her, like, I know better than you. I've been serving in the Senate for, decades. And then cut to now, a few months later, not too much later, California is burning. The skies are orange. And so it's just interesting because Senator Feinstein's a senator from California, and it was a 10-year-old girl sort of laying out her vision for climate change that was so much more accurate than the senator who had been serving for so long. And I think that just like, to me, that is the embodiment of like what it means to show up for your generation, right? Like that little girl was 10. She's showing up in a member of Congress's office and she's sort of speaking truth to power. And I think that there are actually a lot of young people who are doing that. But I think, and I actually think your words and your actions and just even showing up for causes is what is going to drive movement. Sitting at home is not really, complaining or couch activism, like posting something on Twitter, like that's helpful. I think it's helpful to talk to your friends to encourage action, but I think also just putting yourselves out there is also incredibly important.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you so much, Madhu, for joining me here today. I really appreciate your insights. Stay safe stay healthy, and I'll see everybody next time on Inside Politics. Hi everyone, this is Christina. Thank you so much for watching Inside Politics, and please feel free to check out the rest of the interviews on my channel. See you next time!